Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Right to Read initiative. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Mathew Green from Australia. Today we're going to be talking about his journey as an educator. Welcome to the show, Mathew. How are you?
Thank you. I'm really well. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be broadcasting from the other side of the world. It's a little bit early here, so please forgive my croaky voice. But no, it's so lovely to be here, and I'm such a fan of your work, Kathryn, and to get to have a chat today is a real privilege. So yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. All right, so let's start at the beginning. What made you want to be a teacher?
That's a great question. And as cliche as it sounds, I had a teacher that really changed my life. A teacher called Mrs. Taylor-Jones, and she was this wonderful teacher I was born in the United Kingdom, so in rural kind of Nottingham, the middle of nowhere, in this tiny little town called Belper. And Mrs. Taylor-Jones was just one of those really special teachers that I knew that every time I went into her classroom, I just felt valued and I felt known, and I'm sure she did that with every single other one of the students in the class. But for me, it felt like it was really personal. And yeah, I was going through a pretty rough family time when I was in her class, and so yeah, every time I walked in, I just knew it was a really safe space to be. I have no idea what she taught me that year. I just remember how I felt, and so yeah, that was, I think, where it started. I didn't realize at the time, but that's where it started in Mrs. Taylor-Jones's class. And then I had a series of just incredible teachers. We moved to Australia in 1997. And I had a lot of really great teachers in high school. And so, but Mrs. Taylor-Jones was definitely the catalyst that got it started for me. So yeah, if you have a teacher in your life that made a difference, please reach out and say thanks, because I think that the wonderful thing about teachers is that they don't know the impact that they're having on their kids. And a little while ago, I went back to the UK and saw her. I went back with my wife and I sort of proudly showed her, this is where I went to school, and she pretended to be interested. And I met Mrs. Taylor-Jones, and I was a grown man, so I think I was probably 27 at the time, and I saw Mrs. Taylor-Jones and just gave her a big hug, and I had one of those sort of ugly cries, those sort of snotty nose ugly cries on her shoulder, and it wasn't cool. And we walked after we sort of engaged in small talk, and I was telling her about all the things I was doing, and we walked away, and my wife said, look, that wasn't cool. I wouldn't do that again. But I think it just goes to show the incredible impact that teachers can have on our lives. So to answer your question, it was Mrs. Taylor-Jones at Long Row Primary School in Belper in around, I think, 1993.
Wow.
Which doesn't seem that long ago, but it is a really long time ago.
Yeah. Well, and the thing that I want to point out there is, as teachers, I don't think we always understand the impact that we have on some of our students. And I remember a perfect example of this. It was when I was doing my practicum. There was this one student that I wasn't particularly keen on. Like, he was a good student and everything, but he wasn't my favorite in the class or anything. And then, the next, he moved schools or something. And my sponsor teacher contacted me saying, hey, can you send me this information? Because this student loved you. And he wants to share it with his new teacher at this new school. And I'm like, really?
He loved me? Yeah.
He loved me?
Yeah.
Wow. Like I never would have guessed that. So you never know the ones that you really touch. And it's just those one-off comments that can make the student feel special. And it's always nice to know that. Yeah. And I actually remember I sent a message to one of my profs from university, because my first degree is in computer science, and she was a psychology prof. And I'm like, yeah, you know what? We had a couple of these conversations and it really made a difference. And she's like, I'm sorry, I don't remember you. I had thousands of students every year. I'm like, oh, that's okay. I wasn't expecting you to, like some random first year student.
Yeah.
But it's amazing the differences people can make.
And so it's a real reminder as well. Like I have the privilege of I'm a school leader, but every day I'm on class, and so I get the privilege of standing in front of a group of kids and every single day. And it's a reminder that there's no such thing as throwaway comments. You shouldn't be making eye rolls. You shouldn't be talking about kids with other colleagues while they're there, and all these little things that you think, of course. But it's incredibly important, I think, to realize that like words really matter, and we're in a position of incredible authority, and kids hang on our every word. And so it's an important reminder, I think, that we need to get up, we need to do our job, and we need to treat people with dignity and respect, because kids remember that. I also remember teachers, and I won't share who they were, but that sort of really made me feel like a little bit silly or a little bit insignificant. And I think equally we have the power to really build up kids and change their lives, but also we can change them in a negative way if we're not careful. And so I think that's incredibly important to remember, that we are in a position of authority, we're in a position of influence, and it is a privilege. And so there's been numerous times in my class where I've got two young kids where my biological children haven't slept, and I'm just a bit cranky. And I had this student come up to me last term, and she put her hand on my shoulder and said, Mr. Green, you look like you really need a coffee. Are you struggling? And I said, I am really struggling. Thank you for saying that. And that was a really wonderful reminder, I think, that we are also human and we can be honest. And there's been times that I've apologized to students in my class because I've just been a little bit too cranky, or I've just been a bit too harsh. I think my harsh is probably not everyone's harsh. Like my harsh might just be a slightly raised voice, but I've had to apologize and say, look, I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have done that. Let's move on. And so I think being quick to apologize and quick to make it right is really important. And it's all of these thousands of little things that we do each and every day that create those environments where kids can thrive. And so I haven't always got it right. And sometimes I feel a little bit sorry for the kids in my first couple of years of teaching, but I was trying my best and I was doing the best I knew how to do. So I think we all need to give ourselves a little bit of grace and realize just how complicated our job is, but also what an amazing privilege it is to get to make a difference in the lives of kids.
Yeah. And you know what? Especially those young ones who idolize you.
Yeah.
I remember just by chance, the principal at my school, when I started out, his name was Mr. King. And first of all, I thought all principals were called Mr. King because why not?
I had a Mr. Boss as well. And I was like, whoa, like, is that a principal's name? Anyway, yes.
And exactly, like you think they are the best. They are the king of the school. If they know your name, you're so important. And just recognizing that importance of the relationship.
Totally.
But enough about the importance of our role as educators and teachers, because it is hugely important. But today we're talking about you and your journey. So you graduate high school. What do? Do you go straight on that teaching road, or are there a couple steps in between?
Yeah. So I went to the University of Sydney. So I went to high school until 2012 in Sydney, in beautiful Sydney. And I went to Sydney University and did an undergraduate in English and education. So a Bachelor of Arts in English and education. I didn't really know what I needed to do, what I wanted to do, but I always loved reading. I loved learning about education, like learning about the psychology of how we learn. I was always carrying a book with me. I was that kid that was terribly antisocial and always had a book with him, but I was fine with that. And so I did my undergraduate at Sydney Uni. My girlfriend at the time, who we went to school with, who is now my wife, also went to Sydney Uni. So that helped, I think, in my decision in choosing that university. And we did the same undergraduate. She went on to do history and I went on to do educational psychology. I then did my master's at a university called Western Sydney, which was quite full on. So it was a year and intensive master's through coursework. And that was an incredible experience. And then, and then moved on to that. I also did my master's in instructional leadership down at the University of Melbourne. I graduated from there about 5 years ago, so a bit more recently. So I felt really passionate. Like I said, there was a number of people that had changed my life in education. And so I wanted to contribute something back to that. At the time, I was really involved in my undergraduate with some youth work, which was really important to me and sort of, I guess, helped in my decision to go into education. Once I did my master's, I worked in some pretty disadvantaged schools. So I worked over around Penrith in Sydney, which is quite disadvantaged, and then I worked for the majority of my career in southwestern Sydney, so high levels of refugee and new arrival students. And then from that, I went on to a couple of different schools and did some relieving leadership positions, and now I'm permanently an assistant principal at a school about 40 minutes away in a place called Campbelltown, so southwestern Sydney. And it's wonderful, it's diverse, it's full of challenges, but full of incredible opportunities. And so Sydney is one of those places that there's just so much discussion around education. There's so much value in the importance of public education. And yeah, to get to be a part of that is really wonderful and challenging. I feel like I have grown so much working in such a diverse part of Sydney. And I was quite intentional about that. I wanted to see the breadth of school experiences, and unfortunately there's a huge amount of variety in student outcomes depending on where you go in Sydney, and so to get to work in different schools is really exciting. So yeah, that's kind of a snapshot of my journey, and I've been teaching now for about 15 years and love going to work every day. Yeah. Well, hang on, I love going to work most days. Some days are a challenge, but I usually end up the day glad that I'm there. So yeah.
That's wonderful. So you talked about at the beginning doing a bachelor's of arts in education in English.
Yeah.
And I love digging into teachers that have that experience, especially because, at least in Canada, to become a classroom teacher in the elementary years, you need to have 2 English courses.
Right.
And I think that's great. You need to understand literature and everything about that. But I don't feel that adequately prepares you for teaching students how to read. Now, in your coursework, in your English courses, not your educational psychology courses, but your English courses, did they discuss how reading happens?
No, not at all. Yeah.
Did they get into any of the morphology or etymology? It's purely the comprehension side.
Well, I think what was interesting is I did a sort of a generic arts degree because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And my understanding, at least, of the US system, I know this may be different in Canada, but is that you kind of start as a broad sort of social science degree, and then you kind of, through majors and things, it sort of morphs into a degree. Is that the same thing in Canada?
Yeah, so you can go in and do like a bachelor's of science or bachelor's of arts or fine arts, and you pick your area. And then typically there are some programs that are like a 4 or a 5-year education degree.
Right.
But typically you get your undergraduate degree and then you do a year PDP program or professional program to become a teacher.
Yeah. Well, I didn't, I definitely in my undergraduate degree, because I was doing more I did a lot of reading of English. So I was exposed to a lot of literature and Chaucer and Shakespeare and Harper Lee and all of these wonderful resources and wonderful texts. And we did a lot of talking about and analyzing it. But I don't think I was ever taught how to teach kids to read at university at all. Like even in my master's degree, we just didn't do it. And it wasn't until I moved to those sort of low, and my first teaching job was actually in an independent school, so quite an affluent private school. And then I moved to southwestern Sydney, and I was on kindergarten, and I was just told to teach these kids to read, and I had no idea how to do it. And so I wasn't even taught how to do it in a teaching degree. In fact, I don't think we had we did like English and art and maths. We didn't do anything about reading whatsoever, which is terrifying. And I think there's this assumption, at least in Australia, that you will come, and so you should come ready to teach a class. But I had no idea what I was doing. In my practicum, I took a reading group, but had no idea. I didn't know how to teach them to read. I didn't know anything about morphology. I didn't know anything about phonemic awareness. I didn't know anything about comprehension, whether literal or inferential. I just had no idea. And I went on and did a master's degree. So goodness knows what happens to people that do bachelor's degrees. I doubt that there'd be any structure there at all. So I had to learn on the ground. And it's quite challenging because you're in a school. I was in a school at the time that had probably 30 or 40 different languages and hugely diverse, a huge range of linguistic, cultural, religious backgrounds. And I had no idea what I was doing. And I was incredibly grateful to have a wonderful supervisor in that time that helped me. But to answer your question, there was no learning around reading whatsoever in university.
And
Shocking.
that's a common theme that we're seeing globally, really. And luckily, we're starting to change. But again, today's teachers, it's going to take 30 to 40 years to get it. So all teachers, if we have every single teacher education program today start doing how students learn how to read and how to teach reading, it's going to take that time to turn it around. So it's important to establish ways to promote it now and help teachers make that change.
Absolutely. And I've been thinking about this a lot ever since you provided me with the opportunity to come and talk to you. Like, I actually don't know how I learned how to read. And I just remember, for me, like, libraries being a really sort of wonderful, safe space. And I remember discovering like Roald Dahl and like Enid Blyton and all of these sort of quintessentially English authors, and sitting and just getting absorbed into books. But I don't remember how I learned how to do that. And so I guess for me, I just sort of assumed that reading sort of occurred naturally. You sort of just give kids a pack of books and say, off you go. But looking back, I mean, that's obviously ludicrous. It has to be intentional. It has to be taught. It has to be explicit. And it wasn't until I actually was challenged with trying to teach kids how to read that I actually realized what an incredibly rich and complex process it is. And so, to answer your question, no idea. And it's only now, like, I was looking at a couple of documents that have been set. We have an organization called CC, for the Center of Evaluation, Educational Statistics and Evaluation. I probably butchered that, but they've released, and I'll send this through to you after our discussion, a whole range of really great resources about how to teach kids how to read. But that was only sent out, I'm just looking at it now, that was only sent out, I believe, in 2017. So for 8 or 9 years, I was just flying blind and nobody really knew what they were doing. And so, yeah, it needs to be intentional. It really does. And I think as well, like, we've sort of moved away from this like rote reading where, and so we should, where you're given a book, you're sort of told to be quiet, and it's used as a behavior management tool, as opposed to developing that love and developing that passion for reading. And it's just, it's really wrong. And I think teachers of a previous generation have done the best job they can, but that was how that was modeled to them. And it's just not, it's just not good enough anymore. It's not a optional extra in the classroom. It forms, I believe, the very foundation of everything that we do, because think about a maths question. It's a comprehension question. You need to be able to read. You need to be able to generate your opinions and your understandings, and you need to be able to construct writing based on what you've read. And it's the foundation of everything that we do, but yet it's not taught in any way when I was at uni, in any way at university. I hope that it's changed, but my experience with my privilege of having prac students in my class tells me that it is still something which we need to make a lot of progress on.
Definitely. And again, that's echoing everything that I'm noticing around the world, really, with the people that I've been speaking to. There are some schools that are getting it and others that still aren't the same. And, we have problems in the education or the teacher education program where it is the people that are tenured and in those positions haven't done that professional learning.
Yeah.
So they can't teach it to their students. And because of tenure and egos, they're not willing to make the change.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point. I think we have to be, as educators, willing to change and willing to change our practice. And just because we have done something a certain way, even if it was working then, which it wasn't, the world is a dramatically different place now. And I think the issue of tenure is a really important challenge for us to overcome, because it means that people can be comfortable and there's no sort of incentive to continue to improve because, well, I've got a job forever. And so I think that's a really sad truth.
Yeah. So in your master's work, where you were looking more at like the teaching strategies and educational psychology side of things, how did that change your understanding of best practices for teaching in general? And did that translate into your approaches to reading instruction?
Yeah, I think it was hugely important. We talked a lot about the University of Western Sydney, where I did my master's, is an incredible institution. And it was the first time that they introduced a different grading scale. So it was a mastery grading scale. So essentially you either were working towards, you had mastered something or you had exceeded it. So there was really no grades, which were great on one hand, but also a bit of a challenge as well on the other. But yeah, it was really looking at the sort of the psychology of learning in classrooms. I mean, we did a couple of subjects around how to teach maths effectively and how to teach creative arts and dance and all of that kind of stuff. But it was a lot more theory based. And it was a huge shock. I only did 2 practicums before I stepped into the classroom, which was terrifying. And I believe it really didn't prepare me personally for what was expected. I remember getting some brutal feedback from my first practicum supervisor asking if this was a career that I really was considering, which was, I thought I was, and it was really challenging. And that's a whole nother conversation about how we give constructive feedback to teachers. But it didn't really inform at all my reading, my understanding of how to teach kids reading. I sadly took everything that I had learnt at university, or most of the things in university, sort of put them on a shelf and just learnt how to teach from the moment I stood inside a classroom. So there's a lot of theory, which was great, but there really wasn't that that sort of trend. There wasn't that ability to take that. I didn't feel that ability to take that knowledge into the classroom. So it really didn't inform in any way my understanding of how to teach kids reading. The things that did influence how I taught reading were from when I was a kid, like the importance of choosing texts that challenge students and redefine their worlds and cause them to imagine. And like I said, in Roald Dahl, who doesn't love like a chocolate factory? What a great, or a giant peach, or who doesn't love the adventures of Peter Rabbit and Beatrix Potter, where there's these animals going crazy in Mr. McGregor's garden. And so for me, it was that sort of choice, that text selection early on, that influenced the types of texts I put into my classroom. But I do think if I hadn't had that love of reading from a small child, I don't know I don't think my classroom practice would be any good. And so to answer your question, I don't think that in any way I was prepared at university in any way to implement reading effectively. And I think for the first probably 3 or 4 years, I didn't do a very good job. It was just the feedback and the grace of my supervisors that said, okay, we need to fix this. And I do believe that's that really is a common thing. As I mentioned, I have the privilege of having prac students in my class, and I don't think they have the tools and the understanding to be able to implement reading effectively, which is a challenge.
And you mentioned earlier that your then girlfriend and now wife. So it's not like you were just teaching. You had
Yeah,
a life outside of teaching.
true. Yeah.
And as much as everyone feels, teaching actually doesn't stop when the bell rings at school. There's a lot of stuff that you have to do
Yeah,
before and after while still having a life
that's true.
and, taking care of your house, taking care of your expenses, having downtime.
Mm.
So where did you start your path into learning more about reading itself and how to teach reading?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's taken me quite a while to really improve my practice around reading. And I think, let's just clarify, I'm not an expert, but I am continually learning, and I have the privilege of leading a group of amazing educators, and I learn so much from seeing how they do it. And so one of the things, like I said, working in a low socioeconomic school, there was a huge focus and push in literacy. So with that came a lot of money for professional learning. We had what we call an instructional leader, which is someone which is responsible for helping us with our own professional practice, a lady called Emmy, who has transformed the way I teach. And so she really helped me to come up with some sort of a structure around how, for example, practically how we differentiate our reading groups, the types of text that we select, how we incorporate phonemic awareness and graphemes and phonemes into teaching and learning. And so I think it's been a process that over probably 8 or 9 years, I feel like I'm getting more confident with it. I will also mention, like I said, the resources that we use from CC in New South Wales, which are really great. I think it's an incredible organisation that is separate to the Department Department of Education, and that releases some really wonderful professional learning for Australian teachers. And so, yeah, I'm constantly learning how to do it better, but I also know that it's been a bit of a process and a long journey for me. I might just have to move because I've got a little one looking at me. So I just, okay, hang on. Say hi. Okay. Okay.
And these are why we do it, right? The little ones that we're making a difference and understanding the differences in each little child brings into the classroom. I mean, I have 3 children of my own, and each one of them has had a very different journey to reading, from the severely dyslexic who's struggling to the one that read before kindergarten.
Wow.
With the same exposure to text at home and being able to give the support, but it's just the different wiring of the brain and the different support that they need. I mean, all of my children are brilliant. I know I'm biased, but they're amazing little people, and we need to make sure that we understand how to teach in a way that supports their learning.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think the importance of like personalization is super important. Taking the time to get to know the kids in your class and what they're interested in is essential. And I also know that there are, I've really broadened my understanding of what great texts are as well. So in my class, we'll have graphic novels, we'll have audiobooks, we'll have newspapers and comics and informative texts and all of these wonderful things. And I think that understanding of what a text is has moved really far beyond, and so it should. Just a book that you hold. I've got one of my favorite books here, To Kill a Mockingbird, and I think it's moved a lot more from a physical text that you hold, which I think is really important. So that text selection, I think, is essential, and taking the time to really look into that, I think, is really crucial.
Right. So, sorry, did you call it CSIS?
CC, so it's a CESE. So what I'll do is I'll send all of that stuff to you.
For sure. So anyone listening can find that in the show notes.
Yeah.
So is that the only tool that you've used to help with your learning, or have you found other resources or books that have really made a difference?
Well, there is a something that the Department of Education releases is a cater to. It's called I think it's the Cater to Reading Lab, which is a podcast, which is great, and so I can listen to that, I guess, as I'm traveling to work, which is slightly sad, but I find it really interesting. And also, we use some strategies called the Super Six strategies, which are, for example, that would look at summarizing, making connections, understanding text. I think inferring meanings. So it basically takes you through that process of how to go from looking at literal understanding. So, for example, the dog is wearing a hat. What is the dog wearing? The dog's wearing a hat. An inferential questioning could be like, why is the dog wearing a hat? And so building students through those, being really targeted through those different types of reading skills, I think has been, really, really important. So I can send you all of that information so that you've got it. And I just have that on my board. So I might have my lower reading groups really looking at some of the more preliminary skills that could be understanding. So summarizing, for example. So tell me, what do you see in the text? Like, I can see that this text is about whales. I can see that whales are 20 meters long. And it's basically about finding all that key information. And then as we move students through that process, I might have another group working on the next step. And then as we move them through that process to inferring, that's how we specifically target some of those skills for each student. So I use that a lot through differentiated grouping. The great thing, though, is that I can use different types of texts for each of those skills. So, for example, if we're looking at poetry next term, so I can choose a variety of poetry texts, and then I can use different types of text to target the skills that I want to with our kids. So, I think it's about being intentional. Choosing really great texts to start with, I think, is super, super important, and also. I think it's vital to do a pre-read first of the text. I mean, there's no point trying to teach a kid something. You can't just sort of go in and grab something and say, that looks nice or that looks pretty. You actually have to have an understanding of what are the questions you're going to ask? How does this text relate to the students? Is it meaningful? And is it engaging? And so I might just spend a quick 5 minutes scanning through a website that I want to use, or I might spend 10 minutes reading an abstract about a novel, and then really targeting that with my kids, I think is really important. So it's about having a goal. Every student in my class has a reading goal, and that's related to, we have a data collection service called Plan Data. So my learning intentions for each of my kids are based on the type of data I'm collecting. So I'll have my iPad next to me if I'm reading with you, and I notice that one of the boxes that they haven't achieved is can locate key information in text. What I'll do is I say, hey, Kathryn, let's read this together. And my focus for that would be, can you identify 5 pieces of key information? So, for example, how long is a whale? It's 20 meters. What color is a whale? It's gray. And so I'm constantly assessing and constantly aligning the intention of the lesson back to what we need to achieve that outcome. So, there's a lot that goes into it, and a lot of planning. I mean, you have to be organized. I mean, practically in my class, I'm just trying to think of my classroom. Well, I think I've got 6. No, I don't have 7 reading groups, and I've got 30 kids in my class. I've tried to group them in terms of the specific focus that they have, and then I may read with my lowest group 4 times a week. I may read with my highest group twice a week, but it's really all in that text selection, which I think is really important. So hopefully, and I can share some of those resources and a few of the things that I use in my class. And I also have a tracking sheet. So in my last school, we did a really comprehensive reading policy. And each of the groups that I have in each of the reading groups has a tracking sheet. And so what I'll do is I'll take anecdotal notes and I'll say, look, Kathryn today really enjoyed reading and she asked a lot of questions. She was great at finding key information. One of the things that she needs to work on is using fluency and expression with her reading. And so we give our kids what we call the 2 stars and a wish. 2 things they do really well, and 1 thing that I wish they would develop their skills in a little bit more. So, so that's kind of how we do it in class, which I think is really, it's worked really well, I think, to have that kind of intentional structure about how do we teach reading, because it's something which just doesn't happen. I also do like a reading survey with my kids. And so I have like little QR codes that every couple of weeks they can take their iPads, they can scan in, and they can tell me with a scale of 0 to 10 if they're enjoying reading, if there's anything I can help them with, if there's something which they want to read more of. And so I really try and involve them in the process of identifying books that they would like to read. And on that as well, we have a little class library where our kids, they get to choose, each kid as a reward gets to choose a book that they would like to read during a modeled reading session in our class. So our class library is, curated by the kids in our class. And also that's really wonderful because it not only shows them that they are readers, but it also allows them to make their own conscious choices around text. And so we have our guided reading in reading groups. We have our model reading in front of the class. So I'll sit down with you and say, today we're reading All the Things We Can Do by Oliver Jeffries, and we're going to read it, we're going to go through it, we're going to talk about it. And then, of course, they have independent reading as well, where they can choose their own book, and for a little bit of quiet time, they can sit and read and have a chat with their friends. So I think it's very important to be targeting each of those different levels of reading and doing it strategically and also intentionally with our kids. So yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a ramble, but there's a lot going on. And reading for me happens every single morning. So reading groups happens every single morning between 9 and 10 without fail. Like they come in, they know what they're doing. And when I'm reading with a group of kids, we have like a jelly bean table. It's shaped like a jelly bean. It's nothing too exciting. That's why we're very much in the name. And so I will be reading with that group of kids. There'll be other kids at the desks doing work around phonemic awareness. There might be another group doing work around Bloom's taxonomy with their spelling. There might be another group of kids looking at our online reading program. And we use a program called Reading Eggs and also Essential Assessment. And so we're constantly providing opportunities. There might be a group of kids that are focusing on presenting their work that they've read about a history project. They might be creating a Google slide or a Google Doc, or they could be sharing it with another group of students in another part of the school and getting feedback. And so there's constant movement. And with the groups that I'm reading with at the table, it's just 3 short, sharp lessons of 20 minutes. So red group, come to me, let's read, let's take those anecdotal notes, go back to your table, finish the activity. So if we're looking at identifying key information, for example, I might get their iPads and send them back to find key information on a National Geographic resource, and they can brainstorm all of the information and vocabulary they found in that. But I would do that. I read with the group 3 times. I read with 3 groups a day, which is 15 reads.
15 groups a week. Yeah.
And of course, on top of that, we're doing independent reading, where I use that quite often as a lesson break. So just to bring kids down, come and sit in a circle. What book would you like to read today? Obviously, it's intentional, so I make sure that the books are quality that they're choosing. And so reading is very much a part of what we do. And then it flows into writing and English, which is from 10 to 11. We've got word walls that are at student level, which I can't stress how important that is, because I made the mistake of making a beautiful word wall up near the roof, but kids can't access it. So what's the point of that? And any vocabulary we find in text, any subject-specific vocabulary goes on that word wall. And I've got a little a walkway around the outside of my classroom. So that means that all of the walls are accessible. Students can go take words off. They can use them in their writing. And so my reading really does form the basis of everything else that happens in the classroom. And we do the most important things first. And that's, why we do reading first up. So that was a very long-winded answer, but it is absolutely essential. And providing students with opportunities to be able to engage with and create and understand texts has never been more important. And so that's how we we try to do all of those little things in class. I wouldn't say it's chaos, but if you're not prepared and planned, it is chaos. So I say to my team, spend half an hour before each lesson getting it ready to go, getting it up and running. So that's pretty much how we do it in class. There's a lot happening. But that, of course, has been I've been teaching 15 years, and I think for the first 7 years, I didn't do a very good job. So it's been a process, and I think having some wonderful teaching mentors, having some wonderful resources from the Department of Education has really helped. But I would have liked to have started my journey at university and not had to figure it out once I was in the classroom.
Right, of course. And during your discussion of what you do, I think the thing that really jumped out to me is the importance of playing that active role as a teacher the entire time. So you're not just passively sitting there reading with the kids. You are taking those notes and the anecdotal comments that are going to help you inform and personalize, individualize the instruction needed for the students, instead of just saying, okay, well, this is my lesson plan. Everybody gets it. Yeah. This is what we're doing.
And it's flexible, and it should be, because it needs to be. And student grouping is incredibly flexible. I mean, you do tend to have the lower kids, unfortunately, remain together for quite a long time before you see them starting to separate. But you've got to do, with many of the kids, you've got to do a lot of that foundational understanding of what reading is. I mean, in kindergarten, you may be looking at what is a book, what is text direction, what is we call reverse sweep. So how do you go from the top line to the bottom line? How do you continue? And obviously, culturally, for example, Arabic is written the other way and read the other way. And so Japanese is read top to bottom, right to left. And so really getting kids and understanding, especially from those diverse cultural backgrounds, that when we're reading English, we go left to right, top to bottom. And we can never assume that the kids come to us with an understanding of reading, because it may not have been something which was modeled in the home. I was privileged to have that. My parents were both avid readers, and so I went to bed reading each night, but not everyone gets to do that. And so assume nothing, and be actively involved, because it's not a bit of free time for you to do your marking. It's time for you must be involved. And if you get that right, and I always say to my team, you have to, if you plan hard, you can teach easy. And if you don't plan hard, it's really difficult to teach. So take the time, do the planning, choose the quality text, differentiate your groups. If I was speaking to somebody that was just starting out, I would probably say to them, try your best and group your students in ability, depending on what you're focusing on. So it could be summarizing. This is the New South Wales syllabus where I'm from, so it may be different obviously in Canada, but focus on this specific thing you want to get them. So if it's a kindergarten class and they've never held a book, the learning intention would be hold a book the right way up. You can model that. So I would focus on try your best to group your students. It doesn't matter if you're wrong, because students will move up and down, left to right throughout the term, and just choose texts that are really interesting and exciting and engaging. Use a variety of texts, use websites. National Geographic, like I said, is amazing. Use some of the resources from Roald Dahl. Roald Dahl's website is brilliant. Try and incorporate different types of text. So we talked before we went live about audiobooks, storybooks. Choose things that kids are into. And if you don't know what they're into, ask them. Say, who likes books on sharks? And if 15 people say, oh, I like books on sharks, then maybe get a few books on sharks. And so I think it's important to differentiate, though. I'm working with children that are predominantly independent readers. And I think in Australia, at least in those early years, we use what we call leveled text, so texts that have different types of focuses. I know they're not ideal, but there is a little bit more intention in teaching, I guess, a bit more explicit, should I say, in teaching some of those lower year students. But my kids now, we've done all the work, they're independent, and so they can have a little bit more autonomy in the types of text they choose. But in the early years, I think it's definitely a bit more prescribed. I don't know, can I ask Kathryn, with in Canada, do you have leveled text, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, we do.
Because I know that can be controversial.
It is very controversial. And predominantly, most schools exclusively use leveled texts,
Right.
And predictable texts, with very sparse use of decodable texts,
Right.
in a lot of cases. And the debate is just as active here,
Yes.
as to the appropriateness of various texts.
Can I ask what your view? We use decodable text as well a lot. What's your view on the purpose of decodable text, and why are they so important? Or you may think they're not important, but why are they?
I feel they play an important role in beginning reading instruction, because if ideally you're using a systematic synthetic phonics approach to teaching reading. In that case, the decodable text is going to have it so that 90 to 95% of the words are words the student has the skills to decode. So you are setting them up for success, right?
So is it those kind of high frequency words that they will come across that they can't?
Those are explicitly taught.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So and reviewed and previewed before reading the text. So the students aren't expected to guess. They're given the information to learn it. And this is going to help them orthographically map the words, because they're not guessing. They're focusing on the orthography or the letters making up the words, and they have the knowledge to decode the words. As you add grapheme phoneme correspondence or phonics to, you're going to be increasing the complexity. And if a very common scope and sequence begins with the letters SAT, PIN, or SAT-PIN, and the number of VC, CV, and CVC words with just those 6 letters is over 40 meaningful words that are in these children's vocabulary, so they understand what they're reading. And that's the first 6 letters that you can teach fairly quickly.
Yeah.
Right? It's not, whereas another approach, if you're doing a letter a week and using leveled text where they're guessing and using various cueing methods to discover the words, first of all, they're drawing their attention away from the words. So that's going to make it difficult for them to learn them. If you are asking them to memorize a bunch of words and not understand how the word is composed of sounds and how we use letters to make the words, you're teaching them one word at a time. And there are hundreds of thousands of words that these kids are going to need to know by the time they graduate school to be a proficient, fluent reader that can understand what they're reading. That's a lot of words to memorize, right?
We do like a huge amount of work. And once again, I'm talking from sort of an upper primary point of view. I have spent most of my career in K-2, but we do a lot of work with breaking down and reconstructing words. So, for example, if you've got SAT, you're isolating the maybe the AET if you're focusing on that. So then you can create MAT, then you can create FAT and all of that kind of stuff. And so we're trying to show the kids that there are so many different ways to construct new words. And then, of course, linking that to spelling lists. I mean, we don't do a spelling list on the ocean in week 1 because it has no meaning with anything that they have read. And so I know with K-2, we're looking at really building those. That understanding of how to construct and how to deconstruct words, which I think is essential. And then obviously, we tend to create words from the text that we've read, so they're a little bit more meaningful. So each student has a personalized spelling, a set of spelling words, and that may be based on their writing, a word that they're finding challenging. It may be keywords based on some kind of thing that they're some kind of text that they're engaging. So we're trying to make it a lot more meaningful. I know when I was at school, it was very much, we're learning about Egypt. So our spelling word would be hieroglyphics, but it meant nothing to me. And it really didn't give me any sort of understanding of how we create words. But would you suggest doing something like that in terms of how we're teaching spelling, or how do we make it a bit more meaningful, a bit more engaging?
Your spelling words in the early grades, so that K-2 should be following the scope and sequence of your reading instruction, right? And I'm not saying that students need to have decodable text for life. It's in those beginning stages, but once they get to the phase where they're able to rapidly orthographically map words, and they are able to have that large number of phonics already covered, they can be reading what I would consider an authentic text. So it's a real story, and not this one that's specifically controlled for the elements that are in it. That's going to be much more interesting and help them with the orthographic mapping. Now, we also want to introduce the morphology, which is the meaningful units in speech, such as prefixes, roots, suffixes, or base elements. And that can be introduced early on, especially when we're talking about suffixes like ed, plural, ing, and helping them understand the rules associated with it and the spelling patterns that belong with it, as well as talking about why there is that E at the end of some words. Like, it doesn't always do the same thing, and why do we need to have it? So the more informative we can be about that, the better. And then as you progress through the word or through your program, and you introduce more morphemes and more rules about English orthography, or what's a legal spelling pattern in English and how we analyze it. And that's what we want to base the spelling lists off. And you can have it so that you have more of a structured word inquiry where you're looking at particular morphemes and understanding the meaning and incorporating the vocabulary instruction around that. So it's not seeing reading, spelling, and writing as completely separate islands. We need to make sure that we include them together, because when we do spelling and writing using the words and the sounds that we're learning in our reading and our phonics program, it's just going to cement it that much more in our understanding of what we're doing.
Yeah, I think that's so important, to have more of an integrated approach. And I think that for so many years, even when I was at school and even in my early years of teaching, it was very much siloed. And as we mentioned before, like, effective reading forms that basis of everything that we do. So we don't just teach reading and then move on to something else. We are constantly enforcing is probably the wrong word, but are constantly embedding these skills that are absolutely essential. And can I just get your thoughts, Kathryn, because obviously you're the expert of this, and it feels like a bit of a professional learning activity for me. But what are some of your thoughts on how we choose meaningful text and quality text for the classroom? How do we do that? And what sort of things are we, or should we be, looking for?
Well, first of all, in my opinion, reading instruction isn't just in your English language arts blocks or your reading blocks or your language blocks. You want to be choosing quality checks across subjects, and realize that you can embed vocabulary, morphology, and comprehension instruction across topics that you're teaching, you're covering with your students. Now, there are texts that are going to be used in your instruction that are not at the student's reading level, and not ones that you would expect them to be able to decode and read themselves. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't be part of your curriculum or part of your instruction. They are just texts that you need to be the access to reading, right? So whether it's available as an audiobook, whether they're using an e-reader, or whether you are reading it to them, we want to explore or expose them to quality texts with meaningful information. So it's not just having them read, quote unquote, baby books or beginning readers, right? And you definitely want to have the different sources, because in the real world, which we are comparing our 5-year-olds for, 6-year-olds for, they need to realize that it's not all just storybooks with funny pictures or, the beautiful alliteration. They need to realize that, we read cookbooks to understand what we're going to make for dinner. We read the back of products to understand how we use the products, instructional materials, reading a map. So making sure you have those diverse quality of text and understand how to approach reading them. The way that I read a storybook is very different than I read a nonfiction book.
Yeah. We
that's
sort of
part of it from the start.
Yeah, look, that's so important. And in the New South Wales syllabus, obviously I'm calling from New South Wales in Australia, we sort of group our texts into imaginative, informative, and persuasive. And these are very broad topics. And you, of course, can have a informative, persuasive text or an imaginative, persuasive text, but we kind of group them into these areas. And so we were looking last term at informative texts. And so we were looking at recipes. We were looking at some of those, even though that's procedural, it's still sort of telling you something. And then we were looking at IKEA assembly instructions and Lego assembly instructions, because they're text, but of course there's no written words because it needs to appeal to a global audience. And so we were looking at that, and then we were looking at newspapers and looking at persuasive texts, and we did speeches about why this particular Australian is the most significant Australian in history. And so we're doing all of these things. And so we're constantly trying to expose our kids to a vast array of text, because as you said, in the real world, they're going to be reading maps on train stations, or they're going to be reading political commentary and trying to work out what's the source of this and what evidence are they using and all of this kind of stuff. And so we're trying to make sure that we are sort of broadening their understanding a lot more of what a quality text is. And then I really liked your point about how we expose people to really great text during, like, say, modeled reading. And so, for example, like, I've got a whole stack of great authors in a little box near where I sit down and read, and we are constantly talking about language and text direction and different types of font and pictures, and asking their opinions and all of this stuff. And I think, I think it's, like I say, it's so important to make sure that we are sort of ticking all of these boxes. And I think sometimes it can feel a little bit messy because there's so much happening. But I know that through the course of a term or the course of a year, what I see is my students in my class, wherever they've come from, really developing this love and this passion for reading, which is really wonderful. I think for so many of the kids that I work with, they haven't seen themselves as readers. And then I usually survey them at the end of the term and say, like, do you think you're a reader now? And it's really lovely to see such an improvement in that compared with sort of pre and post surveys. And so, yeah, I think it's so exciting. I mean, if you go into my classroom, not now because I've kind of stripped everything down for the end of term, we're on holidays, but what you'll see is, like, just a lot of text, a lot of representation of different forms of text. So flowcharts and different sort of graphic organizers. And so I want to make sure that we're exposing our kids to the vast array of different types of literature and text, because, as you said, once they go out into the real world, they're going to need that. I mean, I have a lot of conversations with my kids about what they want to do when they grow up and that aspiration. And I think it was really sad to see at the beginning of the year that kids thought that readers, you only needed to read if you were going to university. And then we brought in a whole range of tradesmen and tradeswomen to talk about the importance of being able to come up with a mathematical plan and a diagram and how to construct buildings and how to measure things and how to understand. We have a thing called rugby league in Australia. I don't know if you have it over there, but even talking to, like, rugby league players about, like, negotiating contracts for salary, and all of a sudden the kids were like, oh my gosh, like, reading is everywhere. If I want to go to trade school, or if I want to go to university, or if I want to be a stay-at-home parent, I got to learn how to engage in text. And I think making it really practical, and in some ways kind of reducing the leveling the hierarchy, and helping our kids understand that reading is a skill that is for life, and it's something which will serve you well whatever you go into. But yeah, sorry, another ramble, but it's really exciting, and something which I'm hugely passionate about, because it's, I think about some of the sort of the bigger kind of global issues that our kids will face, or the news feeds that they're exposed to on TikTok or Facebook or Instagram, or left or right wing news. Like, I feel like they need to be able to understand, process, and come to some sort of an opinion about what's going on now more than ever. So it's a skill that is truly, it truly is a life skill. So I don't need to convince you about that. I'm sure you know how important reading is, but it really is the foundation on which everything is built. And I really, really wish I had more of an understanding of it from uni, because it was too hard to try and work it out when I got into classrooms.
Of course. And you're not only a teacher, right?
Gotcha.
You and a vice principal. You also are a podcast host.
I am a podcast host,
and
yes.
I just wanted to just give a little bit of time to say what your podcast is and what you do.
Sure.
And I'm sure there's a lot of learning for you in that process.
Yeah, there really is. And thanks for bringing that up, Kathryn. It's something I'm really passionate about. And your episode is out this week. I know we recorded it a really long time ago, but I was a little bit behind, like life kind of moved on. But your episode is out this week, and it's really focusing on reading and reading instruction in your journey. And for those people that are listening to this, I would encourage you to listen to it. But the podcast is called The Art of Teaching. And I guess it started from when I was doing my master's down in Melbourne. I was sitting in these lectures, and I thought, I know this person that should hear about this. I know that person that would find it useful. But I was sitting in a lecture theatre with 30 other students, and I thought, it's just not good enough that these resources haven't got out to as many people as possible. So I started a podcast after years of sort of putting it off and being a bit embarrassed, hearing my voice. I started a podcast, and I've just decided that I'm going to release an episode every single week indefinitely. And it's about getting some incredible minds in education, such as yourself, and also much more broadly than that, experts on leadership, experts on productivity. And it's really trying to bring all these voices together to support teachers. I think one of the things that we noticed with COVID was the ability for everyone to be able to connect online. And so I wanted to make sure that wherever teachers were, whether they're battling Sydney traffic every morning or whether they're on the beach somewhere else in the world, I wanted them to be able to have access to great and high quality professional learning. And yeah, it's kind of become a thing now. So thank you for being a part of it. And if anyone that's out there, if you know someone you'd love to hear from, but you're too scared to ask, let me put myself out there and ask them for you. And yeah, I'm always on the lookout for people doing amazing things, because, and going back to what we were talking about before, what we get to do is an incredible privilege. We get to stand in front of kids. We get to help shape and mold them into incredible individuals, and teachers need to be resourced to do their job. And so, yeah, that's why I started it. So The Art of Teaching, have a look on iTunes. It's on all of those other platform things, but just search for it and it should come up. But yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on it for anyone that's listening. I still don't like the sound of my own voice though, so
Takes
it's a bit cringy. Yeah, I don't know. What do you I mean, you do a lot of webinars and a lot of things with people all over the place. Do you feel like you get more confident at hearing yourself talk, or because you seem like a natural?
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I've been doing advocacy work from a young age, just as an individual with dyslexia. So I've kind of gotten used to it, I suppose. And it's just realizing that the voice in your head sounds different than the voice you hear recorded.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I'll keep going then. You've inspired me to keep going. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And we look forward to talking to you again about your thoughts about reading.
Love to. Thank you so much, Kathryn, for your time. I really appreciate it.